Chapter 3. Stairway to Heaven. The volume of reporting is related to many things. We know that reports of this kind go back to biblical times. Major General John A. Samford, Director of Intelligence, United States Air Force, in a press statement made on July 29, 1952, concerning the UFO sightings over Washington, D.C. earlier that month. He had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth, with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. Genesis chapter 28, verse 12. A stairway to heaven shall be laid down for him, that he may ascend to heaven thereon. The Pyramid Texts, Egypt, circa 2300 BCE. In the previous chapter, we examined one aspect of the ancient Mesopotamian belief system, which included definite references to the creation of human beings by the God to function as slave labor, and the actions taken by God or the gods to keep human beings from controlling their own destinies, to deprive them of authority and of what modern anthropology would term agency. We examined the persistent theme of the sons of God, who mated with human women to produce a hybrid race of giants. These concepts are taken directly from the texts themselves, the Enuma Elish, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Atrahasis, and even the Bible, and are not invented or embellished by us. We suggest they be considered as documentary evidence, or an event that transpired in prehistory that we are calling, for sake of a better word, contact. There is one other persistent theme in these traditions, and that is celestial flight. In other words, buried deep within the stories, legends, and rituals of the ancient Near and Middle East, as well as in cultures worldwide, there is the belief that humans, at least some humans, are able to travel to the stars themselves, essentially reversing the original flow of life from a celestial creator to the earth by going up a ladder or a pole from the earth to make direct contact with the other world. To standard mainstream religious leaders, such an attempt would be anathema. It would be tantamount to building another Tower of Babel, and we all know how that turned out. This type of practice was banned by most religious traditions in the West, and is reserved for persons of special characteristics or abilities in the East, such as shamans. Within Judaism, this practice is known as Merkava mysticism, or Hekhalot mysticism, which is intimately connected with Kabbalah, although probably much older than the earliest Kabbalistic texts. Merkava, or chariot mysticism, derives from the first chapter of the book of Ezekiel, in which the Jewish prophet describes a vision while in exile in Babylon, of a chariot descending from the heavens. This vision became the model for deliberate attempts to reach the celestial realms through the use of meditation and other methods for achieving altered mental states. In other words, there was an understanding, and this may be critical for a serious comprehension of and approach to the phenomenon, that altered states of consciousness were necessary in order to acquire contact with the sons of God. While certain physical aspects of the initial prehistoric contact were mimed, magic circles with lamps, incense smoke, strange sounds, and arcane languages, in order actually to fly heavenwards, a modification of the mind's normal processes was required. If we consider these practices, and they can be found all over the world, as evidence of a real experience that took place millennia ago, then we should be able to apply them to the current problems we encounter in designing systems for space travel, especially the type of travel that would approach the speed of light or exceed it. Those problems may involve propulsion issues, psychological conditioning for extended periods of spaceflight in zero gravity, etc. Or there may be a more immediate application. In our conversations with such controversial figures as Bob Lazar and others, who wish to remain anonymous, we learned that a major obstacle facing the scientists who wanted to re-engineer captured alien spacecraft was the control issue. Without coming down on one side or the other on the validity of the captured alien spacecraft meme, we wish to point out that the difficulty in imagining how to control a vehicle that had no visible means of steering or velocity control, or even an ignition switch, may be an allusion to how the ancients experienced these same vehicles. What is largely missing from the Sumerian, Babylonian, biblical, and other accounts of sightings and contact is the technology involved in controlling the vehicles. No one seems to be steering or otherwise physically manipulating these craft. This leads us inevitably to wonder if they are controlled by some sort of mental mechanism that we do not yet understand. In order to get a grip on this admittedly bizarre concept, we will take the time in this chapter to find out how celestial flight was understood and what common denominators may be found across cultures and eras. Then, in the following chapter, we will look at what happens when celestial flight breaks down, when contact is lost, and a civilization goes crazy as a consequence. Jacob's Ladder. Genesis chapter 28, verses 20 through 22, tells us the story of Jacob, the ladder, and the gate of heaven. The story is familiar to readers of the Bible as the scene in which Jacob falls asleep with his head on a stone as a pillow, and has a dream of a ladder reaching to the heavens with angels ascending and descending, the voice of God from above telling Jacob that the land will belong to him and to his descendants. There is a great deal more to this story, and it has implications for our analysis of the phenomenon. As it stands, there is virtually no other scenario like it in the older Sumerian or Babylonian sources, which are, however, replete with tales of gods and goddesses traveling to the underworld down a series of 7 levels or steps. There are also many instances of shamanic figures rising to the heavens up a pole or a tree to make contact with non-terrestrial forces. Thus, it would be of use to analyze the biblical scenario in light of what we know from these other sources. On its face, the story of Jacob is a mixture of Jewish history and supernatural events. Jacob was the son of Isaac and the father of Joseph, he of the coat of many colors, who became an advisor, a dream interpreter to the Pharaoh of Egypt. It was Jacob who wrestled with an angel, Jacob who was renamed by that angel Israel. The corporality of angels in the Old Testament is an issue to which we will return a little later on in this chapter. It's one of the most jarring characteristics of angelology in the Bible, for it goes against the popular notion of what an angel is supposed to be, but is much closer to what we discussed in the previous chapter concerning the sons of God and the Apkallu. For now, though, we will focus on the episode of Jacob's Ladder. One of the problems of biblical interpretation is the way in which we project backwards in time, analyzing biblical events as if they were superstitious stories intended for the entertainment of children or the gullible. The other approach is to take every word as the literal truth. Often the reality may be found somewhere in between these two polar opposites, In the case of Jacob's ladder, we have a real event that has been obscured by so much reverse interpretation that it has lost much of its impact. Since we do not, as moderns, credit any story that includes a tangible, visible connection between this world and an alleged or putative other world, the entire scenario must be an invention or even a deliberate deception. Jacob was the twin brother of Esau. The Bible is very clear on this point. They were both contending with each other in their mother's womb. Jacob wanted to be the firstborn of the two and held on to his twin's foot, as if to drag him back into the womb. That is how he got his name, Jacob, which means one that takes by the heel. Esau, on the other hand, was born with a full head of hair and complete bodily hair, as if he was already an adult. Thus, his name comes from the Hebrew for finished. As the firstborn, Esau was destined, according to tradition, to inherit his father's wealth. His father was Isaac, the son of Abraham, the founder of what we now call the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Isaac was nearly slain by his father when God ordered Abraham to sacrifice Isaac as a demonstration of his loyalty. At the last moment, an angel stayed Abraham's hand, and the life of Isaac was spared. Thus we have the appearance of an angel who is the intermediary between Abraham and God, and who convinces Abraham that the original commandment of God that Abraham sacrifice Isaac is not to be followed. This must be seen in context. At the time, child sacrifice was not uncommon, even among the Jews. The biblical references to Moloch should be proof enough of this. But there is much other archaeological and textual evidence that child sacrifice was common in the Middle East at the time of the Abraham and Isaac episode. As we will find out in the next chapter, child sacrifice was also common in the New World, among the Olmecs, Toltecs, Aztecs, and Incas. It may be too harsh or outlandish a critique, but what if child sacrifice performed a type of genetic selection function? Certainly, with every child that was killed before they reached puberty and could have children of their own, their genetic substance was effectively removed from the gene pool. If, as the ancient texts suggest, human beings were created as a race of workers for the pleasure of the gods, then they would have a vested interest in weeding out those children who were unique enough genetically to pose a threat to the status quo. As it turned out, Isaac was one of those children, because from him issued the entire kingdom of Israel, a nation that would eventually turn to monotheism as a rejection of the plurality of the gods and of their henchmen, the sons of God. Isaac eventually married Rebekah, a woman from Abraham's native Mesopotamia, and it was Rebekah who bore Esau and Jacob. Prior to her marriage to Isaac, she was blessed by her family with the words, "Our sister, may you increase to thousands upon thousands. May your offspring possess the gates of their enemies." Genesis chapter 24, verse 60. This same blessing is still used today in traditional Jewish weddings. Esau and Jacob, her sons, were of completely different dispositions. Esau was a hunter, an active man, rough, who, against his parents' wishes, married local Canaanite women who were idol worshippers. The implication is that Esau was also an idol worshipper. Jacob, on the other hand, was a quiet, introspective sort, who spent most of his time in study and pious reflection. His mother decided that when the time came, It would be Jacob who should inherit his father's legacy, and not Esau, whom she saw as irresponsible and uncaring about his birthright. Thus the famous episode in which she dressed Jacob in the skins of animals to imitate Esau's hairy body, and sent him in to the nearly blind Isaac to get his father's blessing instead of Esau. Thus, Jacob's inheritance of his father's birthright was the result of an elaborate deception on his part and his mother's. It is often justified on the grounds that Esau was not a fit candidate due to his lack of respect for his parents, his tradition, and his people. Jacob fled his home ahead of Esau, who was filled with rage at the deception and wanted to kill Jacob. Jacob was making his way to the home of his mother's family when he fell asleep on the stone and had his famous vision. He had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth, with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. There above it stood the Lord, and he said, "I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west, and to the east, to the north, and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you, and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you." When Jacob awoke from his sleep, he thought, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it." He was afraid and said, "How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven." Genesis chapter 28, verses 12 through 17. There is again the emphasis on reproduction, of the spreading of seed throughout the world from a single source that we found in the blessing of Rebekah, Jacob's mother. The theme of reproduction, of massive reproduction to cover the earth, is a constant one in Genesis. Indeed, it is from the same root that we get both words, Genesis and genetics. But what is of equal importance is the idea that there are angels ascending and descending the stairway to heaven. First, the angels are mentioned as ascending the stairway. From where are they ascending? We must assume it is from the earth. The implication is of ongoing two-way traffic of these angels between the earth and heaven, which is consistent with our concept of the Bene Elohim, or the Apkallu, as remaining influential in terrestrial affairs long after the flood. The second important concept is that of a technology, the stairway, or actually ladder, in Hebrew sulam, that permits two-way traffic between the earth and the heavens. While we learned in the previous chapter of the sons of God mating with the daughters of men and producing giant offspring, the Nephilim, we now have a glimpse of how they landed on the earth. Another theme that can be noticed is a repetition of the phrase "on earth" or "of the earth," with the earth referenced as a place distinct from other places. God is clearly not on the earth or of the earth. Neither are the angels. The earth is a laboratory, a test site. There are many tests of humans by God throughout the Bible. An object viewed as if from afar by beings who are not part of its environment or its context. These are beings who have no personal stake, no real investment in the outcome of the planet, and who can casually destroy entire cities and races of people in a fit of pique. In the case of Jacob, as with his mother Rebekah, there is a definite plan in mind. Their offspring will reproduce unhindered. This is a promise of God to Jacob, who is now assured that God will assist him in his every endeavor to cover the earth with his offspring. That seems to be the sum total of God's interest in Jacob, one involving territory and offspring. Basically, God is promising Jacob Lebensraum, and tells Jacob he will not leave him until he has done what he has promised, implying that when he has accomplished this goal, he will leave. When he awakens, Jacob anoints the stone he had been sleeping on. Pouring oil over a stone is an ancient Middle Eastern custom. The stones were often meteoric stones, and the name for such a stone is Betalis. This is a Greek word that actually derives from the biblical account, for Jacob names his stone Beth-El, which means house of God. Bethel is the original form of Betalis. There are many such traditional stones in the region. The Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem is built over one such stone, believed by some to be the spot where Abraham was supposed to sacrifice Isaac. Even the Kaaba of Mecca is said to be of meteoric origin, and its position as an object of worship predates Islam by many years. In fact, the Prophet Muhammad, a member of the Quraysh tribe that was in charge of the Kaaba when it was a pagan shrine, cleared out its 360 pagan idols and rededicated it as sacred to Allah, thus reinforcing the idea that the meteoric rock was a symbol of the connection between this world and the other world. If we consider that the Dome of the Rock is another important Islamic shrine, then there is a kind of axis of polarity between the two stones. This is emphasized by the role that the Dome of the Rock plays in what is known as the Miraj, the flight of the Prophet Muhammad up the seven heavens on a mysterious beast called the Burak that seemed to be a kind of flying horse. In this instance, the Prophet is sleeping at the Kaaba in Mecca when the Burak appears along with the angel Gabriel. The Prophet mounts the Burak and is taken immediately to the farthest mosque, which most agree is a reference to the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, where the Dome of the Rock is located. From there, he ascends to the heavens to meet all the prophets who have gone before him. He is then returned to Mecca on the Burak. It was during this flight that the Prophet is told he must tell his followers to pray 5 times a day. Thus, we once again have the presence of an angel, a flight to the heavens, and a commandment from God. The presence of a meteoric stone in both the accounts of the Mirage and Jacob's Ladder may be significant. Because of the presence of magnetite and meteoric rocks, a piece of these rocks could be used in the manufacture of compass needles. Not only did these rocks descend from the heavens, but they also pointed to the North Star. They played the role of cosmic messengers, as well as navigation devices. This dual function was not lost on, for instance, the ancient Egyptians, who used a device made of magnetite in the shape of the Big Dipper, called the Thigh of Set, in the opening of the mouth ceremony, in which the mummified pharaoh would be reanimated by this magical implement. Opening of the mouth ceremonies were used in Babylon as well, in order to animate statues of the gods. The idea was that the opening of the mouth and nostrils of either the mummy, Egypt, or the statue, Babylon, would enable the figure to breathe and speak. The association of the meteor from the heavens, its magnetic quality and immortality, as well as the association with the gods, is a concept that reinforces our suggestion that life on this planet was believed to come directly from a supernatural source and did not arise spontaneously on Earth, The involvement of angels in subsequent iterations of this theme further emphasizes this connection. In fact, the very concept of the Apkallu survived into the immediate pre-Islamic period among the Bedouin in the form of the Abgal, the Sumerian word for Apkallu, as a local deity that was half human, half fish, a clear reference to the Owens of Berossus. The primary deity of the pre-Islamic Kaaba was Hubal, a god that was brought to Mecca by the Quraysh tribe from Mesopotamia, and specifically from what is now Iraq. The function of the Prophet Muhammad, therefore, was similar to that of the Jewish prophets: to eliminate polytheism and replace it with a pure form of monotheism. Like the early Jewish prophets, however, that did not mean that the Arabs stopped believing in the existence of other gods. They simply relegated them to subordinate status, or classified them as demonic. This is not, strictly speaking, monotheism, but henotheism, a kind of preference of one god over all others. Henotheism is a reasonable outgrowth of polytheism in the face of evidence that multiple supernatural forces exist, whereas the polytheist may feel inclined or compelled to worship a multitude of deities. The henotheist recognizes that the other deities exist, but is committed to the worship of only one above all others. The henotheist may even redefine the other gods as angels, demons, or, in the case of the Bedouin, jinn. Although mentioned several times in the Quran, and especially Surat 72, which is entitled Surat al-Jinn, information concerning the jinn is known to predate Islam by hundreds of years. The jinn are invisible to human eyes, but are just as corporeal and can interact with humans, according to Arab and later Islamic belief. Like humans, they also have free will, and thus some have converted to Islam, as the previously mentioned Surat attests. A book published about the jinn by the Foundation for Islamic Knowledge in the United States, for instance, devotes more than half of its chapters to a discussion of Shaitan and Iblis, two names used for the ruler of the jinn. The idea is that the jinn more closely represent demons than humans, and although some have converted to Islam, it is still forbidden for human beings to converse with them in any way. They are said to have been created from smokeless fire, molded into human shape, and can sometimes take the form of serpents and other unclean animals. Iblis, the king of the jinn, was ordered to kneel before Adam to show respect for the created human, but he refused, and for this reason was cast out of heaven. This is a story similar to that told by the Yazidi, who claimed that Shaitan committed this sin out of love for God, for he could not imagine bowing before anyone but God. The Yazidi believed that Shaitan will be the first of God's creatures to return to heaven, and when he does, the Yazidi will follow him. This conflict between God and the creatures of God is therefore a common theme throughout much Western religion and culture. The sons of God, who mated with human women, created such a problem on earth with their quasi-hominid offspring that God felt the only solution was to destroy the world with a flood and start over. This conflict did not end, for when Jacob begins his return home after his long sojourn away, he is confronted with another angel, and this time is forced to wrestle with it. Jacob and the Angel. The account given in Genesis chapter 32, verses 22 through 32, is as ambiguous as the story of Jacob's ladder. It again involves a supernatural being who becomes involved in Jacob's life for no immediately discernible reason. At this point in the narrative, Jacob is moving with his family and worldly possessions back to his home. He finds himself alone on one side of a river, at which point, and apropos of nothing, someone comes out and begins to wrestle with him. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go, unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men, and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." Whereas much that happens in the life of Jacob is clear narrative, with an identifiable cause and effect linear storyline involving human beings with discernible motives and reactions, Isaac, Rebekah, Esau, etc. When it comes to the supernatural elements, they are out of context and seem unrelated to the general narrative. In this case, someone comes out of nowhere and begins wrestling with Jacob. He is described as a man repeatedly, which indicates that as far as Jacob was concerned, at least initially, he was dealing with a being that was fully corporeal. In order to defeat Jacob, the man had to exert a little Vulcan on Jacob's hip, thereby dislocating it and causing Jacob to limp forever after. There is no rational explanation for any of this, in spite of the fact that most of the rest of the story is entirely rational, or at least credible to a degree, allowing for exaggeration or poetic license here and there. This episode, however, is dropped into the narrative flow, and there must be a reason. When Jacob leaves his home for the first time, he has his encounter with the ladder. When he returns home, he has his encounter with the man. He later identifies this man as an angel, or actually as God, for the word Peniel means face of God. He claims he has seen God face to face and survived. His name is then changed to Israel, which means he strives with God. So he has gone from Bethel, or house of God, to Peniel, or face of God. Bethel was the gate of heaven, a Jewish version perhaps of Bab Eli, or Babylon, the gate of God. We still do not understand the motive of the man for wrestling with Jacob, unless it was a poetic device to show Jacob's strength and qualifications for being the sire of an entire people, the people of Israel who were named after him. In any event, it is entirely possible that the segue from man to God is predicated on the idea that the being with whom he wrestled was an angel, as it is often interpreted, one of the sons of God that we have encountered already. In a paper published in Glossolalia, Yale scholar Catherine Pacalico offers an interpretation of the story based on anatomy. She suggests that the injury suffered by Jacob was not caused by a blow to the hip socket itself, since that part of the anatomy is inaccessible externally, but by a blow to the heel, which would then transfer the force of the blow to the hip joint, thereby dislocating it. There is a pleasing symmetry about this solution, for Jacob's name refers to the heel, since he was grasping Esau's heel at birth. The wounding of Jacob's heel is a kind of karmic balancing of his debt to Esau for having deceived him and robbed him of his birthright. Thus, this story sets up the next day's meeting between Jacob and Esau, a meeting that Jacob had been dreading, and which is the reason he stayed behind after sending his family on ahead. This solution has the advantage of rescuing this bizarre episode and placing it, somewhat precariously, in the narrative flow. It still does not, however, explain how it came about in the first place. The conclusion of this specific episode is vitally important, for it introduces the name and concept of Israel and reaffirms Jacob's role as the father of the tribes, even as he is going to meet his brother, whom he wronged. Jacob asked for the man's or angel's name, and is instead rewarded with the question, "Why do you ask my name?" Jacob then jumps to the conclusion that the man was actually God himself. Jacob's experience of the latter took place at night, a time of darkness and sensory deprivation. So did his encounter with the wrestler. In both cases, Jacob was on the verge of a major change in his life. In the first instance, he was fleeing his twin brother Esau. In the second, he was going to meet him. If we were to interpret this story from a shamanic perspective, we would find that enough elements are present to support at least a second look from that point of view. A ladder reaching to heaven, an experience of God, visions of angelic forces, a struggle and physical maiming as a result, leading to direct contact with the divine. Another telling detail is the limp. As described elsewhere, this characteristic has a long pedigree in esoteric symbolism. A limp is associated with the shamanic Chinese practice known as the pace of you. This practice involves the shaman walking on the stairs of the Big Dipper, known as the Great Chariot, itself a suggestive reference, on the way to the celestial pole, which is the throne of immortality. The pace of you is based on the story of the shaman known as Yu, who became ill and developed a limp after a particularly strenuous ordeal. The Great Chariot itself is often represented in China as personified by a goddess of the chariot, sometimes depicted as riding in a chariot being drawn by 7 boars, representing the 7 visible stars of the Dipper. The stars of the Dipper are understood by the Taoist practitioners of the pace of you as a ladder leading from the earth to the heavens, and ultimately to the pole around which the entire cosmos turns. The Dipper, in this instance, serves as a gateway to heaven, just as Jacob's Bethel. In the second-degree initiation of Blue Lodge Freemasonry, there is a similar ritual. The basic symbol of this degree is the winding staircase, which can be interpreted as a version of Jacob's ladder. The initiate is expected to walk in an exaggerated fashion around the area of the temple, to the 4 cardinal points of the compass. Remember that God tells Jacob that his seed will extend to the 4 quarters of the world. The Masonic temple represents Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, which is where, of course, one finds the sacred rock of the Temple Mount, the site from which the Prophet Muhammad performed his famous flight to the heavens. What these brief references are meant to convey is a constellation of themes cognate to celestial flight, experiences of angels or other supernatural beings, and the resulting initiation of a human being in contact with those forces. The themes we discussed as mentioned in Genesis concerning Jacob are those that can be found in a number of other places around the world, in different cultural contexts, and as such, interpreted differently in each culture, but nonetheless demonstrating many elements in common. If we entertain the idea that the angels so often mentioned in the Bible are related to, if not identical with, The strange beings we studied in the previous chapter that were corporeal, could appear and disappear at will, could even cohabit with human beings, and who acted as representatives of the Creator on earth. Then we have biblical, as well as Babylonian precedents for the modern concept of alien contact. Perhaps the listener can determine why the term alien is so problematic in this context, for it is a contemporary label loosely applied to an ancient experience. The ancients were actually much more explicit in the way they described these beings, as intermediaries between us and the forces that created us. Themes such as reproduction, blood, seed, and subservience to authority were interpreted in purely religious contexts as civilization changed from the Sumerian model to more recent versions, and as that transformation was taking place, the original information was reframed as fables and superstition. There is, however, a technology at work here. This technology is of the very essence of those machines we have seen in the skies above our world. A technology that involves both the visible material world as well as the unseen world of our ancestors. It involves the first examples of celestial flight. Ezekiel's vision. Jacob had his vision of a ladder and angels ascending and descending, with God standing at the top of the ladder looking down from heaven. Not to be outdone, Ezekiel had a vision of God descending from heaven, not down the steps of a ladder, but in his own chariot. This vision inspired a mystical practice that is known as Merkaba, or chariot mysticism, the basic method of which involves ascending the usually 7 levels of heaven to reach God. Merkaba mysticism is also known as the descent to the chariot, for reasons that are not very clear at all. As mentioned before, Chinese mystics called the Big Dipper the Great Chariot, or sometimes the Golden Chariot. To the Babylonians, the Dipper was known as the Great Wagon, mar.gid.da. The ancient Greeks referred to it as the Amaxa, or chariot. To the Arabs, it represented a funeral bier, which nonetheless retains the sense of a wheeled vehicle. The Dipper is an asterism, part of the Ursa Major constellation, and it circles around the pole star. To find it, one looks north. On July 31st, 593 BCE, by the banks of the river Chabar in Babylon, the prophet Ezekiel had a vision. According to his account, he was looking due north when the vision occurred. I looked, and I saw a windstorm coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning, and surrounded by brilliant light. The center of the fire looked like glowing metal, and in the fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. In appearance, their form was that of a man, but each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. Their legs were straight. Their feet were like those of a calf, and gleamed like burnished bronze. Under their wings, on their 4 sides, they had the hands of a man. All 4 of them had faces and wings, and their wings touched one another. Each one went straight ahead. They did not turn as they moved. Ezekiel, chapter 1, verses 4 through 9. There is much more, but for now we can begin by making some preliminary observations. The vision, as we shall find out, is eventually described as a chariot. That it was seen in the north may be a further indication that Ezekiel is referencing the Dipper. The 4 living creatures, along with their wheels within wheels, Ezekiel chapter 1, verses 15 through 21, can be said to represent the 4 stars of the Dipper that were commonly used to represent the rectangular body of the chariot. The description of the 4 living creatures is remarkably similar to something that Ezekiel would have seen in Babylonian captivity. The huge bas-reliefs of the Apkulu, half-bird, half-man creatures with 4 wings and the hands of a man that were a common feature of the architecture. The vision seemed to be a coded reference to something taking place that could only be explained by inserting clues recognizable to those Jews living in Babylon during the exile. They would include not only the architecture, religion and customs of the Babylonians, but also the architecture and religion of the Jews, especially where Solomon's temple, the first temple, was concerned, the temple that was sacked and destroyed by the Babylonians. Ezekiel's vision became the focus of intense scrutiny, not only among the Jews, but also to later generations of Christian Kabbalists as well. In fact, study of Ezekiel's vision was prohibited to all but the most advanced Jewish scholars, and even then it was not to be discussed with others. It seemed to hold the key to understanding how human beings could make contact with the divine. It is this idea of Ezekiel's vision as an instruction manual for alien contact that brings it to our attention as we try to strip away some of the purely denominational or ideological accretions. Not easy to do when discussing the visions of a pious Jewish priest, to find the technology beneath the surface. Ezekiel stood at the crossroads of Jewish and Babylonian, and therefore monotheist and polytheist traditions, and his vision reflects those elements, even as it introduces new ones. If we look at them through the lens of what we know of the phenomenon, however, a spectrum of clarity is introduced that transcends traditional mainstream religious ideas of God, gods, angels, and even prophecy. So much has been written in an attempt to decode Ezekiel's vision from the point of view of UFOs, ancient astronauts, and the like, that to reprise all of those theories here would be counterproductive. That Ezekiel is talking about an event so bizarre that he is at a loss for adequate language to describe it is obvious. It reads like the first science fiction story ever written, with a being in an impossible vehicle that seems humanoid but not completely, descending to the earth and, in Ezekiel 8, virtually abducting the Jewish priest. These quasi-human beings are already familiar to us from the Mesopotamian and biblical contexts, and it is odd that there has been so little focus on this aspect of the religious traditions that have contributed to the ancient alien hypothesis. Rather than speculate about the Anunnaki or the Igigi and theories concerning mining operations in missing planets, a more fruitful approach might be to contemplate the persistence of historical accounts involving beings that have hominid features and characteristics, but which are perceived as non-human in some particular way, as these experiences are inescapable and still occur with regularity down to modern times. It is necessary to ask why there is a near global pattern of contact with these non-human beings, and why there is a similar pattern in global creation literature of the manufacture of human beings by other forces, something that is not obvious, but which is somehow inferred and taken for granted. A look at Ezekiel's vision and how it has influenced beliefs and practices concerning non-human contact may provide us with an answer to some of these questions. The language of Ezekiel's vision is not ordinary language. That is, it cannot refer to ordinary events or commonplace occurrences. Although the words can be defined, and the grammar is normal, the way in which the vision is described defies rational interpretation. This is a phenomenon that we find throughout mystical literature, not only in the Middle East, but in India and other parts of Asia as well. In fact, this tendency to write in what seems to be a deliberately obscure fashion is also found in European alchemical texts. In India, this is called Sandhya Bhasha, or intentional language, sometimes translated as twilight language. The later Merkava texts, the Masa Merkava, or works of the chariot, that use Ezekiel's vision as their template, are written in a similarly obscure prose. This seems to represent an effort to transcend normal rules of language, as the experiences they describe transcend normal experience. This is, of course, part of the problem in the modern era, when eyewitness statements concerning the phenomenon are ignored by academics and scientists because of their woolly language and otherworldly terminology. This results in statements being dismissed because the eyewitnesses or experiencers are not scientifically trained observers, which is most people, and thus an entire body of evidence is ignored because the human observers did not go to the same schools or get the same degrees as the scientists. Ezekiel's vision begins, as noted before, with the appearance of a kind of vehicle. He does not use the word chariot, Merkava, until much later, that has an unknown or unidentified propulsion system. According to Ezekiel, the faces on the four sides of the body of the vehicle face in the direction of travel. These four beings are referred to as the Heyo, or living creatures. Below the four beings with the four wings and the four faces, man, lion, ox, and eagle, can be seen the wheels, or the Ophanim. They are described as a wheel inside of a wheel, and seem to run along the outside or perimeter of the vehicle. Sitting on a throne made of sapphire in the vehicle is the likeness of a man. He seems to be the one who controls the vehicle. That he is sitting is relevant, for the Heyo do not sit, and they are specifically described, in the excerpt, as having legs that are straight. The implication is that they do not bend at the knee. This may refer to a tradition that angels do not have knee joints, meaning their legs are always straight. They are always standing at the ready. In later works of the Merkava mystics, we learn that Metatron, sometimes identified with the prophet Enoch, sits on a throne before the inner sanctum where God is to be found. The fact that he is sitting causes some mystics to mistake him for God, since angels cannot sit down, at least not in the presence of God. These Heyo, therefore, may be angels, or they may simply be the struts that support the vehicle, as they have the appearance of burnished bronze. Above the head of the man in the throne is an expanse sparkling like ice, and the sound of the rushing of the wings, like the roar of rushing waters. The man himself is fire from the waist down, and glowing metal from the waist up. He is surrounded by a radiance like a rainbow. A voice comes out of the vehicle, directed at Ezekiel, who falls down before it. He is told to take a scroll that is handed to him, to eat it, and then to repeat its words to the people of Israel in exile. It is a prophecy full of dire warnings. Here we must stop for a moment to digest the previous scene. It is obvious why recent generations have interpreted this as describing a UFO. To be fair, it is a flying object, and it is unidentified, at least insofar as the description does not make a lot of sense. Yet the most revealing part of this vision may be the prophecy itself. It is a truism that virtually every experiencer who has had contact with the phenomenon in a close encounter with an alien, has come away with a dire prophecy for humanity. These involve end-of-the-world scenarios, environmental disasters, and world wars. The aliens never arrive with a message of praise and congratulations for their human hosts. Instead, they show up in supernatural vehicles with awesome technological capabilities, appear humanoid with the likeness of a man, and then deliver their hideous prophecies and leave. What we wish to point out here is the relative consistency of this experience from ancient biblical times to the present. The fact that Ezekiel eventually will be abducted by the being in the chariot is further evidence that we are dealing with a single unitary complex of ideas and images that is repeated endlessly from era to era, from culture to culture. We don't wish to go into great detail on the nature of Ezekiel's vision and his subsequent prophecies concerning Israel, the temple, etc., as they are specific to his time and place. There are Mesopotamian motifs here and there in the narrative, which is only to be expected. And we may wonder if the likeness of a man seen by Ezekiel is related to the humanoid figures that appeared to the Sumerians and gave them knowledge and wisdom. But a comprehensive analysis of the data is beyond the scope of this work. What is of relevance to us now, though, is the fact that this document became the model for one of the earliest forms of Jewish mysticism, older even than the Kabbalah itself. As mentioned before, this practice was considered so dangerous that only the most pious and most learned were permitted to study it, and even then they could only discuss their findings and presumably their experiences with one other person and no more. In fact, this practice can be found at the heart of some of the Jewish messianic movements that spread throughout Eastern Europe, beginning with Shabtai Zvi and later Jacob Frank. These movements also influenced the development of some modern esoteric societies and occult orders. And one can trace the evolution of much New Age spirituality and organizations back to that day on the banks of the Chabar River in Babylon, when a priest in exile looked up to the northern sky and saw a chariot flying down to confront him, challenge him, and carry him away. Works of the chariot. First and foremost, the chariot, as seen by Ezekiel, and which appears again to carry the prophet Elijah to heaven, 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 11, is a vehicle. It is, in all of these cases, a flying object. It implies transportation, but of a celestial character. The chariot is a device for traveling to heaven. There is even a chariot in the heavens, the asterism known to us as the Big Dipper, but to many other cultures worldwide as a wagon, Charles's Wain in England, or a funeral bier among the Bedouin, but mostly as a chariot. Thus, the works of the chariot involve celestial travel. Celestial travel is usually understood in this context to mean a spiritual experience, something that occurs as the result of prayer, meditation, and contemplation. That is not the whole story, however, for not all prayer and meditation leads to the experience of descending to the chariot. Rather, what we are discussing is a very specific form of practice with a unique methodology, and it is based on an actual event. It is as if a cult had developed around Kenneth Arnold's sighting in 1947, or the experience of George Adamski a few years later, by people who would imitate as closely as possible the circumstances of the original sightings. In other words, it is not to be understood as spiritual in the generally accepted sense of the term, but as a technology whose aim is to duplicate the original experience by adopting many of its features. Like the cargo cults we discussed at the very start of this study, what is happening is what appears to be a ritual on the one hand and a practical exercise on the other. A modern person stumbling upon the ersatz airstrip, bamboo air traffic control tower, and coconut headphones of a South Pacific cargo cult would recognize the scene immediately, even though it was not a real airport with any hope of witnessing an aircraft land. The same is true of the works of the Chariot. They represent a simulacrum of a genuine event. And while it is possible that a Pacific Islander who belonged to a cargo cult could have a spiritual experience, meaning an experience that alters his or her consciousness due to the intense focus on the rituals of the cult, so too does the descender to the Chariot. It is this experience that may be the key to understanding the mechanism of the Chariot, the controls, propulsion, and navigation systems. This is because our linear approach to this problem is inadequate, so far, and does not take into account the different intellectual and psychological structures of the visitors who created them. In order to get close to an appreciation of the phenomenon, we need to see differently, and practices such as the works of the Chariot enable us to do that. Second, the descender to the Chariot works alone. In fact, the rabbinic tradition demands it. Ezekiel was alone by the river when he had his experience. This sense of isolation from society, at least for the duration of the experience, is as much a modern phenomenon as it is biblical. Most experiencers, who, by the way, are almost always accidental descenders, rarely have their experiences in groups. Abductions usually involve only one person at a time, usually at night. This isolation indicates that the experience is an internal one, whether generated internally or due to a selection process which we do not understand as yet. Third, the practitioner must be psychologically, intellectually, and spiritually prepared. There is a very real reason for this, and that is because this type of experience can unhinge a person who is unstable mentally or emotionally. This is a caveat from virtually every mystical practice in the world, from tantric yoga to ceremonial magic, and including, of course, the works of the Chariot. The intensity required by this practice is such